The Progressive Era and Muckrakers. So what we're going to do is we're going to be introduced to kind of a new era of US history called the Progressive Era, and we'll take a couple of lectures to kind of unpack the Progressive Era. So this is like the Progressive Era part 1. So we're going to talk about kind of what the Progressive Era was, and then we're going to look at a series of like citizens who are nicknamed muckrakers. And so there's going to be a whole list of different people in US history that we're going to mention kind of one at a time. And so this is a little introduction to the Progressive Era, and then we're going to look at a whole bunch of American citizens who are making waves in the Progressive Era. And so we're going to get started. So the first thing to kind of understand is this. Remember the Gilded Age? I hope you still remember the Gilded Age, but there is a lot of social problems that develop due to the rapid industrialization we see in the Gilded Age. And so the muck and the mud of the Gilded Age needs to be cleaned up. And so what we're going to see is the Progressive Era then is going to try to clean up or solve the problems created by the Gilded Age. And so we're going to be looking at what the Progressive Era is, and then today we're going to be looking at a lot of what are called muckrakers. So like she's a muckraker right here, cleaning up society. So here's some definitions. So Progressive Era defined, right? An era that sought to address the problems that arose in society with the Industrial Revolution and the growth of modern capitalism. So as we're seeing this increase in kind of just a huge change in how our economy works, we're going to see a lot of issues. And so the Progressive Era is going to try to solve those issues, fix those problems. And then muckrakers are the people within the Progressive Era who are going to at least bring attention to some of these problems we see in society. So muckrakers defined. Reformers who worked to expose social ills and corruption, oftentimes not offering solutions, but seeking to bring attention to a specific issue. So oftentimes muckrakers are going to bring attention to, child labor, or the fact that women can't vote, or to the fact that alcoholism is an issue. And so they're going to be kind of shining a spotlight on specific issues to try to bring people's attention to those issues. And so Progressive Era, cleaning up the muck left behind by the Gilded Age. So like I said, what we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to look at a whole bunch of different muckrakers. So you can see there's 13 different muckrakers, and we're just going to talk about really briefly like who they are and what they're known for, because they're trying to shine a light on some of these problems, social ills that are in America, specifically after the Gilded Age and our rapid industrialization. So we're just going to take them one at a time. All right, so let's get started here. The first one here is Jane Addams, and we've mentioned Jane Addams before when we were talking about new immigrants that come over in the Gilded Age. But she inherits a lot of money, about $50,000, and in today's money, that'd be about $1.22 million. So she has a lot of money, and she doesn't quite know what to do with it. One of the ideas is that she goes to London, and when she's in London, she visits a series of settlement houses. Remember, settlement houses are supposed to help recent immigrants kind of settle into your country. And so she decides to use her inheritance to build a settlement house in her own native state of Illinois. So she's going to build the Hull House, which is in Chicago. We mentioned this before. But at its height, it had 25 women who lived in the Hull House and really served as kind of volunteers to run all of these programs that were helping out recent immigrants, whether it be classes in English or daycare or programs with hygiene or, clubs or arts or choirs or whatever it might be. So at its height, there's 25 women living there and kind of working there. At its height, about 2,000 visitors per day. And at its height, it grew into a complex of 13 different buildings. And remember, the whole goal here is to aid recent immigrants to Chicago. And because of the Hull House and her efforts there, she actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. So you go, Jane Addams, you go. You build the Hull House. You build it. So that's what Jane Addams is up to. And she's really focusing on kind of like recent immigrants. Next, we have Upton Sinclair. And Upton Sinclair is writing a book. and the book he writes is called The Jungle. And this is like a really, really classic work of American literature here. And so the idea is he goes to Chicago and he spends 7 weeks kind of undercover in the meatpacking district. And so meatpacking plants is when you take a cow and you kill it, and then you like process the different parts, and then you sell off the meat. And so he goes into this meat packing plants in Chicago for 7 weeks, and based off of that experience, then he takes it and he writes a novel. So the novel is like fiction, like the story and the characters are made up, but it's based off of kind of what he saw when he visited the meat packing district of Chicago. And the whole idea is he's trying to shine a light on how bad the conditions are for the worker in these meat packing plants, right? He's trying to get Americans to have compassion for these recent immigrants and the types of work they have to do. But really, the big impact was not necessarily getting Americans to have compassion on the workers, but really the bigger impact is Americans are reading this book and they're asking like, what is in this hamburger I'm eating? What is in this hot dog I'm eating? This is so disgusting. Like the stuff he's describing in this factory or in this meat packing plant was absolutely disgusting. So Americans are more concerned about like the quality of the meat than necessary about the people who are working in the plants. And so Sinclair said, I aimed for the nation's heart, but I hit its stomach, meaning he's trying to get people to have compassion for those who are working in the factory, but instead, like, people just got grossed out about how unhygienic the meat was. And so Jack London, who was also a socialist, and so we'll see here in a second, Upton Sinclair was a staunch socialist. Jack London, who's another famous author at the time, said this is the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the wage slave, meaning that Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was trying to get Americans to have compassion for those who were enslaved in the South, and now Upton Sinclair is writing this book trying to get Americans to have compassion for the wage slave of the North, those who are working for starvation wages up in the North. And so the whole idea here is, besides just this book, and we're actually going to mention this book later on, because this book is going to cause some legislation to be passed. But besides just this book, like I said, Upton Sinclair is a staunch socialist. In fact, the book itself ends with the main character becoming a socialist and living happily ever after. But he actually starts his own socialist colony, and it burns down. And we'll see this oftentimes in utopian communities. Apparently, it's just a trend that they burn down, although there's a lot of people who believe that it was arson, that someone burned it down on purpose because they weren't so much a fan of the socialism. And then later on, he's going to run for Congress. He's going to run for governor of California. I don't believe he wins any of these elections, although I could be wrong. But really, you can see he's going to be spending his life trying to change society, if not through a book, but through change in the political realm. All right, so that's Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. Dun, dun, dun. Moving on. All right, so next we have John Dewey. And so John Dewey is about reform in education. I'll go down here. And so he is a thinker. He's a philosopher. And really the philosophy he puts forward is called pragmatism, which means, like, specifically when it's applied to schools, it's the idea that the curriculum should teach practical skills, just not content knowledge alone. And so pragmatism, you probably have heard of this before, of like someone's really pragmatic. It means they're really like practical about the problem they're facing or the situation they're facing. And so pragmatism kind of applied to the idea of education is, once again, the curriculum should teach practical skills, not just content knowledge alone. The book he wrote is called Democracy in Education, which is aptly named because what it's talking about is the fact that education is so vital in a democracy where citizens have to vote or get to vote. And so democracy in education is just making the point that education is an absolute necessity in order to have a democracy where life will flourish for its citizens. And once again, the other idea is his idea is that social reform should take place in schools. That if you want to change something that's wrong with society, well, you should use the schools to change or to fix those problems. And so John Dewey trying to change education for the better. All right. Moving on then is the social gospel movement. And this is Walter Rauschenbusch, which is a fun last name. And so it's a German last name in case you're wondering, but he's a Baptist preacher in Rochester, New York. And he had this big conversion experience when he was 17, and then he was just on fire for God. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to spread the kingdom of God, not through hellfire preaching, but by Christians who were leading a Christ-like life. He was really critical of a lot of mainline Protestant churches who really weren't doing anything to alleviate the suffering of the poor. And so he's kind of trying to wake up the sleeping giant, that is the Christians, who he believes should be bringing about social change, right? That if you're a Christian, it shouldn't be a name only, but should be seen through your actions. And so a lovely quote there: whoever uncouples the religious and the social life have not understood Jesus. Meaning that if you're a Christian, we need to put this gospel into society, the social gospel movement. You need to actually act like Christ in the world. Walter Rauschenbusch. All right, next we have Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in rural Mississippi. And so when she was still a little kid, emancipation came to Mississippi. And so as she grew up, she became a teacher, but 3 of her friends were lynched for their economic success. And after that point, she spent the rest of her life really campaigning against lynching. I believe one of her friends had opened a grocery store that was competing with a white-owned grocery store. And so he was lynched by an angry mob. And so after this experience, she really spends the rest of her life really on a crusade against lynching. And so she's also a part of the Niagara movement, which eventually turns into the NAACP. So if you remember W.E.B. Du Bois and the Niagara movement and the NAACP, she is right in there as well. So she was a part of the Niagara movement, and then she became one of the co-founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So that's Ida B. Wells. Moving on. Another Ida, this time Ida Tarbell. So Ida Tarbell has some personal issues with Rockefeller. The idea is her own father had owned a small oil refining business, but his business was crushed, put out of business by Rockefeller. And so what she does is she starts to investigate the history of the Standard Oil Company, which is, of course, the oil company that pretty much had control of most of the oil refining business, Rockefeller's business. And so what happens is she publishes her book kind of as a series in McClure's magazine. It's called The History of Standard Oil Company. So there'd be a new installment of this every month or whenever each new magazine issue came out. And really it's showing Rockefeller as this crabby miser who uses vicious and unfair tactics to grow his monopoly. And so she has kind of a personal tiff with Rockefeller because of what had happened to her father, but she seeks her revenge through, becoming a muckraker and trying to uncover some of the underbelly, the kind of nasty underbelly of the Standard Oil Company. All right, moving right along. All right, next we have Gifford Pinchot. So Gifford Pinchot, once again, kind of grew up very wealthy. So his family had made money in the lumber industry, and his parents had sent him to Yale. And so he grew up in a lot of privilege. But the idea is he saw firsthand how commercial interests were really just destroying the forests. And he thought we need to change things. And so he came up with something called the conservation ethic, which is the idea of using the natural resources in a way that maximizes benefit for mankind. So it's not just about preservation, rather it's about conservation. He's okay with use the natural resources. He's okay with using them, but he wants to use them in a way that's responsible, in a way that it's actually benefiting humanity in the best way possible, not wasting them, but using them wisely. He's a friend with TR, of course, being Theodore Roosevelt, and we'll actually talk about the progressive presidents next time, if you will. But he and TR are buddies, and TR appoints him as the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, and then later on, Gifford Pinchot is going to be governor of Pennsylvania as well. So when we're talking about kind of environmentalists, Gifford Pinchot is definitely one of definitely one of those to note. All right, scooting right along, we have Jacob Riis. And the idea is he was an old immigrant, meaning that he immigrated from Denmark before the Civil War, so he would be a part of kind of that old immigration. And he started out as a carpenter, but eventually found his way into photography. And so apart from his impact in U.S. history, he's well known in kind of the history of photography because he really pioneers the use of flash photography. So even apart from his impact on America during the Progressive Era, he's just known for this kind of innovation in using flash photography. And so what he does is he goes around into the slums of New York, and he's from New York, and he just takes a lot of photos of really kind of what's happening there, the violence, the poverty, the really horrible living conditions, and he publishes them in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And so his goal is to show kind of maybe the middle and upper class ranks of society in New York, really what is going on in the slums. Because a lot of these people have never been there and they really don't understand the extent of the poverty that's within their own city. And so it's not like a chapter book, it's a picture book. It's a collection of his photos, really trying to shine a light on the poverty in the slums of New York. Because of this book, for example, at this time, TR is not president yet. Theodore Roosevelt is only governor of New York. And so because of this book, TR actually introduces a nighttime police force to help combat some of the violence in the slums that take place at night. So we're just going to look at some pictures. So there's Jacob Riis. Here's the picture. So these little guys are sleeping in a stairwell. And I'll just kind of looking at. So a lot of people would actually work in their homes. And so here's a family who's living and working under one roof. All right. And so it's just kind of really showing people this is what's happening in your own city, New York. Wake up, wake up. All right. Moving on, Carrie Nation. Now, Carrie Nation is one fun lady to have a conversation with. At least I'd imagine that. So here's her background. So Carrie Nation had been married to a Civil War doctor, but he became a severe alcoholic and later died of alcoholism. And so when he died, she had, I think, one young son and really felt the impact of alcohol firsthand, or what alcoholism can do to a family firsthand. And so she was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And remember, when we're saying temperance, really the goal of temperance at this time is to outlaw the consumption and the sale of alcohol. And so they're working for not just temperance, like just not taking it in moderation, but really their ultimate goal is to outlaw it. And we'll see, like in the 18th Amendment later on, they are successful. So she's working towards that. And she had some pretty interesting tactics on how to accomplish her goal of ending, deadbeat dads who are alcoholics, things like that. And so what she would do, what originally started, is she and her ladies would go in front of a saloon and they would stand out in front and they would sing, they'd have an accordion, they'd be singing hymns, and they'd be trying to get the men inside to kind of change their ways, maybe guilting them a little bit to leave the saloon. But at one point she got really mad and she threw a rock through one of the saloon's windows. And she was arrested. And then her husband, her new husband, said, you know what? Wouldn't it have been easier just to bring an axe with you? And she said, that's the most sensible thing you've said since I've married you. And so from then on out, what she would do is she had a hatchet, or like an axe, and she would go into the saloons and she would be singing and praying, and she'd be going in with her hatchet and just tearing things to bits, like breaking bottles, breaking windows, breaking the cash register, whatever she could do to kind of terrorize the saloon. Because of these efforts, she was arrested 30 different times, and actually to raise money to pay for all of these fines, she would actually give lectures and then she would sell little souvenir hatchets for those who came. And so she was taking matters into her own hands, right? She would say, men, I've come to save you from your drunken fate. One hatchet, one saloon at a time. And so, there's more than one way to be a muckraker. You don't have to write a best-selling book. You can just take a hatchet and start going to town on saloons. All right, moving on. All right, next we have Lincoln Steffens. And the idea is he is going to be a muckraker at the city level. So what he does is he goes into a lot of large kind of major cities of the United States, and he starts just to investigate, trying to find the dirt. So he would go into Minneapolis, spend some time investigating Minneapolis, trying to find political corruption, and then he would publish a report over what he saw in that city. So he'd issue a report like the shame of Minneapolis. Then you go into St. Louis, dig up the dirt, issue a report, the shame of St. Louis, the shame of Milwaukee, the shame of Chicago. And then what eventually happens is all the reports are collected and they're published just in one book, The Shame of the Cities. So The Shame of the Cities is a collection of articles about political machines and political corruptions that he found, political corruption he found in several large cities across the United States. And just personally, he was a big proponent of social revolution. He didn't think reform would do enough. He didn't think reform would fix all of the issues. And so he was a big proponent of actual social revolution. So when the Russian Revolution breaks out during World War I, he's going to be a big fan of the Russian Revolution. And so that's just kind of what he's doing. He's looking at corruption in politics at the city level. We're getting there. Next we have Eugene Debs, and we've talked about Debs before. Debs is kind of rose to national attention as he led the Pullman strike. But just to kind of introduce him again, he is going to be, our token socialist presidential candidate during this time. He's going to run for president 5 different times as a socialist, and obviously, he's not winning. He doesn't win any of those times. But besides that, he is a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, also known as the IWW. And so he is really going to be against World War I. He doesn't like it at all. In fact, he actually encourages people to resist the draft. And because of that, he is thrown into jail. He ends up spending 5 years in jail, and his health starts to fail once he's in jail, which rhymes. That's kind of fun. And he'll die of heart failure soon after being released from prison. But even while he's in prison, he still runs to become president. So the 5th time he ran for president, he was actually in jail for speaking out against World War I. And so that's Eugene Debs, and really he wants, like I said, he's a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World. So he, along with like Lincoln Steffens, really wants to completely overthrow capitalism. He wants a social revolution, not just reform. All right, here we go. Robert Fightin' Bob Lafayette. And so Fightin' Bob here is from Wisconsin, and he's really a good example of kind of the progressivism on the state level. So Lincoln Steffens was kind of progressivism, if you can say that, on the city level. This guy is at the state level, and he is, like I said, a militant progressive from Wisconsin. So he was a governor first, later on became a senator. And really, he's a progressive. So these are all different things he tried to do. One is to regulate large industries, which means getting more control over them. So increasing regulation of the railroads, of the banking system, of utilities. So think like electricity, things like that, insurance. He's really just going to try to regulate a lot of these industries. He's also going to create some tax reforms, increase workers' rights, etc. So really, he's going to really kind of take the bull by the horns in Wisconsin and try to fix the problems that he sees. He also comes up with something called the Wisconsin idea. I shouldn't say he comes up with it, but he really applies it to the state. And the Wisconsin idea, in part, is the idea that the university in the state should actually be working toward the betterment of the whole entire state. And so using the University of Wisconsin to actually impact the whole state for the better. And so my understanding is that he had some of the faculty at the University of Wisconsin working towards finding a better way to I don't know if the word's regulate to regulate the utilities of the state to make it cheaper, fairer for the people living in Wisconsin. So this Wisconsin idea then can spread to other states as well. So he is our political reformer on the state level. He's our progressive in the state of Wisconsin. All right. Last we have Alice Paul. And Alice Paul is really kind of one of our main suffragettes at the time. So Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they had since died, right? And we're still in our first wave of feminism. And the first wave of feminism, their goal is to get the right to vote. And so Alice Paul is really leading the charge, or one of those leading the charge to get the right to vote for women. And so she's going to organize a lot of different things. She's going to organize demonstrations, marches, hunger strikes. She's going to be arrested 7 times in the process. But one of the things she's most well known for is a campaign called the Silent Sentinels. Silent Sentinels. So this is a group of women who for 2.5 years would stand kind of silently outside of the White House just to protest the fact that women don't have the right to vote. And so the idea is they were criticized because while this was happening, World War I was breaking out. And a lot of people thought, give the president a break. He's fighting a war. Why are you insisting on the right to vote now? We have bigger fish to fry, that sort of thing. But in a sense, it works because it's going to end once women do get the right to vote, which comes in the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment, we'll actually mention this later on. The 19th Amendment, I think, is ratified in 1920. But so you can see it's going to be Alice Paul and others who are working towards getting the right to vote. All right. Kind of as a side note, there was a movie kind of recently, maybe not that recently, called Iron-Jawed Angels, that really follows her life. So if you are wanting to know more about her story, you can look up Iron-Jawed Angels. And also, when she'd get arrested, sometimes she'd go on to hunger strikes when she was in jail. And there's more than once that she was force-fed. So that involves kind of shoving a tube down her throat and force-feeding her raw eggs. So once again, she has more than one bumps. She has some scars from her work trying to get women the right to vote. All right, so just to kind of review, we're looking at the Progressive Era, fixing the problems left behind from the Gilded Age, and we're starting by looking at some muckrakers. People are trying to shine lights on different social ills of the time, not necessarily offering solutions, but at least bringing it to the nation's attention. The next time, then, what we're going to do is we're looking at the Progressive Era, but we're going to look at the Progressive Era in the White House. So we're going to look at 3 different progressive presidents and see what they're doing to try to solve the problems of America.